I never imagined that the hardest part of burying my father would be defending the home he built with his own 2 hands. The morning of my dad's funeral began with a gray Ohio sky hanging low over the cemetery, the kind of quiet, steady drizzle that soaks into black coats and makes everything feel heavier than it already is. I stood beside the casket, my gloved hands folded tightly in front of me, greeting neighbors who had known my family for over 40 years. The scent of lilies and damp earth mixed in the cold March air, and for a moment, I let myself believe that this day would be only about honoring my father, Robert Collins, a man who worked 35 years at the same manufacturing plant and paid off his modest 3-bedroom house brick by brick. That house sat on Maple Drive, 1,200 square feet of memories, with a white porch railing he repainted every spring and a maple tree he planted the year I turned 10. I had moved back into that house 12 years ago when his health began to decline, giving up my condominium and my quiet retirement plans so he wouldn't have to face doctor appointments and long nights alone. I managed his medications, cooked his low-sodium meals, and sat with him through countless evenings as he retold stories about his childhood, stories I had heard 100 times but never interrupted because I knew he needed to feel heard. My younger brother, Daniel, visited when he could, which wasn't often, always with big promises about helping more once his business picked up. I never questioned him, not publicly, because today was not supposed to be about old resentments or private disappointments. Today was supposed to be about gratitude and closure. As the pastor finished speaking and the final hymn drifted softly across the folding chairs set up on the grass, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had done my duty as a daughter. I had kept my promise to Dad that he would never leave this world feeling abandoned. I thought the worst of my grief would be the silence waiting for me back at Maple Drive, the empty recliner in the living room, the coffee mug that would never again be left in the sink. I had no idea that before we even left the cemetery grounds, my brother would clear his throat, step forward in front of our relatives, and begin a sentence that would change everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the meaning of home. Daniel did not wait until we reached the reception hall or even until the last handful of soil had been placed over the casket. He cleared his throat loudly, the way he used to do when he wanted attention at Thanksgiving dinners, and stepped in front of the small crowd of relatives who were still lingering near the gravesite. I remember the sound of wet grass beneath his shoes and the way a few cousins turned toward him, assuming he was about to share a final memory about our father. Instead, he slipped one hand into the pocket of his black coat and said, in a steady voice that did not match the occasion, that there was something important the family needed to know. He said that since Dad was gone, it only made sense to move forward with practical decisions. He said the house on Maple Drive would be listed for sale within the month. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. The drizzle continued to fall, tapping softly against umbrellas, and I felt as if the air had thinned around me. Daniel went on to explain that maintaining the property was too much responsibility and that selling it would allow him to take care of certain financial obligations. He did not use the word gambling, but I knew what he meant. I had seen the late-night phone calls, the tense messages, the pattern of borrowing and repaying that never quite balanced out. He spoke as if he were announcing a routine home improvement, not the sale of the only place our father ever truly called his own. A few relatives exchanged uncertain glances. One of my aunts pressed her lips together and looked at me as if waiting for my reaction. I felt heat rise in my chest, not from anger alone but from disbelief at the timing. We had not even left the cemetery. Dad's casket was still visible behind us, framed by damp earth and folding chairs. I finally found my voice and asked Daniel, quietly but clearly, what he meant by we. He replied that as the only son, he would handle the arrangements and that the proceeds would be divided after his outstanding debts were resolved. The word debts hung in the air like a stain. He added that I had lived in the house long enough and that it was time for both of us to move on. Move on. As if the past 12 years of caregiving had been a temporary inconvenience. As if the nights I slept in a chair beside Dad's bed during his recovery from pneumonia were just sentimental gestures. I looked around at the familiar faces of neighbors who had watched me carry groceries into that house week after week, who had seen the porch light glow long after midnight while I organized medications and insurance paperwork. I realized then that this was not a private conversation that had slipped out at the wrong moment. Daniel had chosen this stage. He wanted witnesses. He wanted to appear decisive, responsible, in control. What he did not know, as he stood there outlining his plans with calm confidence, was that our father had anticipated far more than either of us realized, and that Maple Drive was not as simple a transaction as my brother believed. I stood there in the damp grass, looking at my younger brother as if he were a stranger wearing Daniel's face. The drizzle had grown steadier, tapping against the black umbrellas above us, and still he continued speaking as though he were presenting a sensible business plan instead of dismantling our father's legacy. He began explaining that the real estate market in our county was strong, that comparable homes within a 5-mile radius had sold for over $300,000 in the last 6 months, and that it would be financially irresponsible to let sentiment interfere with opportunity. The word sentiment landed like an accusation. I felt the eyes of our relatives shift between us, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding that would soon be corrected. I kept my voice calm and asked him when he had decided all of this. He replied that he had been thinking about it for a while and that Dad would have wanted us to be practical. That was when something inside me hardened. Daniel had not been the one measuring Dad's blood pressure twice a day. He had not been the one sitting in the emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning, filling out insurance forms under fluorescent lights. He had not been the one who memorized the sound of Dad's breathing at night to know when something was wrong. Yet here he was, invoking our father's wishes as if he had been the steady presence during those final 12 years. One of our cousins gently suggested that perhaps this conversation could wait until after the reception. Daniel shook his head and said there was no point delaying the inevitable. He added that I would have time to find an apartment and that at 67 years old, I deserved something smaller and easier to manage. Easier to manage. As if my life could be reduced to square footage and utility bills. I felt a flush creep up my neck, not because I was ashamed, but because I realized he believed he was being generous. He believed that by giving me notice in front of witnesses, he was proving himself fair. He did not see the cruelty in turning a farewell into a financial briefing. The cemetery staff began folding chairs in the background, and the sound of metal legs clicking against each other echoed faintly across the grass. I glanced back at the fresh mound of earth that now marked my father's resting place and silently promised him that I would not allow his life's work to be erased by impatience and poor decisions. Daniel concluded by saying he would contact a realtor the following week and that paperwork would be straightforward since we were the only heirs. That was the moment I understood how confident he was. He believed ownership was shared automatically. He believed that years of absence carried the same weight as years of devotion. He believed that grief would make me compliant. I folded my hands in front of me once more, the same way I had done beside the casket, and let him finish. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue in front of the family. I simply looked at him with a steadiness he had not anticipated, because what he did not yet know was that our father had not left things to assumption, and I had not spent 12 years by his side without learning exactly how prepared he intended me to be. We left the cemetery in a quiet procession of cars, headlights cutting through the gray afternoon as if nothing unusual had just occurred, and I rode alone in my sedan back to Maple Drive with Daniel's words echoing in my mind. Sell the house. Move on. Find something smaller. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in a steady rhythm, and I found myself remembering another rainy day 12 years earlier when I had stood in the doorway of this same house with a suitcase in one hand and a box of medical supplies in the other. That was the day I moved back in after Dad's first serious fall. He had tried to laugh it off, insisting he was still strong enough to handle the stairs, but I saw the truth in the way he gripped the banister. I told him it would be temporary. Just until he got steadier on his feet. Temporary turned into a year, then 5, then 12. I converted the small dining room into a bedroom for him so he would not have to climb the staircase, measured the space carefully to fit a hospital-style bed without crowding the hallway, and installed grab bars in the bathroom after watching 3 online tutorials. I learned the difference between generic and brand name prescriptions, memorized his cardiologist's extension at the clinic 15 miles away, and kept a binder with every lab result neatly filed by date. When the utility bills rose in the winter, I adjusted the thermostat and layered blankets over his knees instead of complaining. When the roof began to leak over the garage, I climbed a ladder myself and sealed what I could before calling a contractor, because I knew Dad worried about every dollar. Daniel visited occasionally, bringing store-bought pie and promises that he would look into assisted living facilities, as if that were a generous solution. Dad always shook his head and said he wanted to stay in his own home. He would look at me then, not Daniel, and say, "Thank you, Maggie." Those 2 words carried more weight than any inheritance ever could. By the time we pulled into the church parking lot for the reception, I had already lived a dozen lifetimes inside those walls. I had watched the maple tree in the front yard grow taller, had painted the shutters navy blue one summer afternoon because Dad said it made the house look proud. I had listened to his stories about building the back deck with a borrowed set of tools and a neighbor's help, about scraping together a down payment of $5,000 in 1978, about how owning that house made him feel like he had finally given his family something solid. Daniel saw square footage and market value. I saw every Christmas morning, every birthday cake baked in that modest kitchen, every quiet evening when Dad and I sat on the porch counting fireflies in July. As I stepped out of the car and adjusted my coat, I realized that what Daniel had dismissed as sentiment was in fact stewardship. I had not simply lived in that house. I had protected it, preserved it, and honored the man who built it. And long before this funeral, long before Daniel decided to speak for the family, Dad and I had already had a conversation about what would happen to Maple Drive when he was gone. The conversation Dad and I had about Maple Drive did not happen in a lawyer's office or during some dramatic final confession. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at our kitchen table, the same oak table where I had done my homework as a child and where he now sorted through his mail with careful, slower hands. The sunlight had been coming through the window over the sink, catching the dust in the air, and he had been unusually quiet. Finally he looked at me and said, "Maggie, I need to make sure you are protected." I remember telling him there was nothing to protect me from. Daniel was my brother. We were family. Dad gave me a look that was gentle but firm, the kind of look that told me he had already thought 3 steps ahead. He admitted that Daniel had asked him for money several times over the past few years. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. He said he had helped when he could, but he had begun to notice patterns. Promises to repay that never quite materialized. Explanations that changed with each visit. Dad was not an unkind man, but he had worked too many double shifts in his life to ignore warning signs. He told me he had met with our longtime family attorney, Mr. Henderson, whose office sat above the hardware store on Main Street, and that he had updated his will and the deed to the house. I remember feeling uncomfortable as he spoke, as if discussing paperwork meant admitting that time was running out. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine and said, "This house stays with the one who stayed." Those words settled deep into my heart, though I did not fully understand their weight until the day of his funeral. He explained that Daniel would still receive a financial portion of the estate, but the house itself would be legally transferred in a way that could not be contested easily. I asked him if that would create tension between us. He sighed and said tension was better than regret. He wanted to ensure that I would never be forced out of the home I had preserved. After that afternoon, life returned to its routine of doctor appointments and grocery lists, and we rarely spoke of the paperwork again. I kept copies of important documents in a fireproof box in the hall closet, more out of habit than expectation. Standing now in the church fellowship hall after the funeral, listening to the hum of polite conversation and the clink of coffee cups against saucers, I realized that Dad's foresight had not been unnecessary caution. It had been clarity. Daniel moved from table to table shaking hands, presenting himself as the responsible son handling affairs. I watched him from across the room and felt a calm certainty replace the shock that had gripped me at the gravesite. He believed the sale of Maple Drive was inevitable. He believed that grief would cloud my judgment and that public pressure would silence me. What he did not realize was that the decision he had announced so confidently had already been addressed years ago, signed, notarized, and placed safely in my keeping, waiting for the exact moment when it would matter most. While Daniel refilled his coffee and accepted sympathetic nods from relatives who had only heard his version of responsibility, I quietly stepped away from the reception hall and walked down the familiar corridor toward the church office. I needed a moment of silence, not because I doubted what Dad had arranged, but because I understood that timing would determine everything. The hallway smelled faintly of furniture polish and old hymnals, and as I stood by the window overlooking the parking lot, I took a slow breath and reminded myself of the fireproof box in the hall closet at Maple Drive. Inside it were certified copies of the updated deed and the will, both signed and notarized 3 years earlier. Dad had insisted that I keep them accessible, not hidden, because he believed preparedness should never feel like secrecy. I returned to the fellowship hall just as Daniel was explaining to our cousin Mark that he would contact a realtor by Monday. He was outlining estimated listing prices and commission percentages as though he were presenting quarterly earnings. When he noticed me approaching, he gave a brief nod and said he would stop by the house later that evening to discuss next steps. I met his gaze and told him calmly that there would be no need for that. He frowned, confused, and asked what I meant. I said that before any discussions about listing agents or market values, we should schedule a formal reading of Dad's will with Mr. Henderson. A few conversations around us softened as people sensed a shift in tone. Daniel forced a smile and replied that a reading was unnecessary since we both already knew we were the only heirs. I held my posture steady and answered that clarity never hurts anyone. He hesitated, then agreed, perhaps assuming the paperwork would confirm his expectations. What he did not realize was that Mr. Henderson had called me 2 days before the funeral to express his condolences and to confirm that he had the original documents prepared for review. Dad had been meticulous. The deed to Maple Drive had been transferred into my name through a life estate arrangement that ensured he retained residence rights until his passing, after which full ownership would pass directly to me without probate complications. Daniel would receive the remaining liquid assets divided according to the percentages Dad had specified, but the house itself was no longer part of a shared estate. As Daniel resumed his conversation, I felt neither triumph nor anger. I felt steady. For 12 years I had learned that stability comes from quiet consistency, not loud declarations. I finished greeting the last of our guests, thanked them for attending, and drove back to Maple Drive alone. When I stepped inside, the house was silent in a way it had never been before. I walked to the hall closet, knelt down, and lifted the fireproof box onto the floor. My hands did not shake. As I unlocked it, I reviewed the documents carefully, noting each signature, each embossed seal, each date that proved this decision had not been impulsive. Dad had anticipated the possibility that love and loyalty do not always move in equal measure. As I placed the papers back inside and closed the lid, I understood that the next time Daniel spoke about selling this house, he would be speaking without authority, and I would be ready to answer him not with emotion, but with facts. The next morning, Daniel called just after 9 o'clock, his voice brisk and businesslike, as if we were coordinating a yard sale instead of discussing the home our father had built from overtime pay and careful budgeting. He said he had already left a message with a realtor he knew through a friend and that we should meet at Maple Drive that afternoon to walk through the property and discuss minor upgrades that might increase the listing price. I listened without interrupting, standing in the kitchen where Dad and I had shared countless cups of coffee, and then I told him that before any walkthroughs or phone calls continued, we would meet at Mr. Henderson's office at 2 o'clock for the formal reading of the will. There was a brief silence on the line, followed by a restrained sigh. Daniel said again that it was unnecessary, but I repeated the time and address calmly and ended the call. At 2 o'clock sharp, I was seated across from Mr. Henderson in the modest conference room above the hardware store on Main Street. The walls were lined with framed certificates and shelves of leather-bound volumes, and the steady hum of the air conditioner filled the pauses between words. Daniel arrived a few minutes late, offering a quick apology and settling into the chair beside me with visible impatience. Mr. Henderson expressed his condolences and then opened a manila folder containing the original documents. He began reading in a measured, even tone, outlining the distribution of Dad's savings accounts, personal property, and modest investment portfolio. Daniel leaned back with a look of quiet confidence, as if everything were unfolding exactly as expected. Then Mr. Henderson turned to the section regarding the residence at Maple Drive. He explained that 3 years prior, Dad had executed a life estate deed transferring full ownership of the property to me, Margaret Collins, effective immediately upon his passing. He clarified that this arrangement ensured the house would not be subject to division or sale without my consent. Daniel shifted forward in his chair, interrupting to ask what that meant in practical terms. Mr. Henderson answered plainly that it meant the house belonged solely to me. There would be no joint decision regarding its sale. There would be no division of proceeds. The property was not part of the remaining estate because it had already been legally reassigned. The room grew noticeably still. I did not look at Daniel immediately. I kept my eyes on the document as Mr. Henderson continued, citing the notarization date, the county recording number, and the legal description of the lot size and boundaries. Every detail was precise. When I finally turned toward my brother, I saw confusion give way to disbelief. He said there must be some mistake, that Dad would never exclude him from something so significant. Mr. Henderson gently explained that Daniel had not been excluded from the estate as a whole, but that the residence had been designated to the child who had been residing there and providing full-time care. The language was clear and deliberate. Daniel's jaw tightened as he processed the implications. The confident tone he had used at the cemetery was gone. In its place was the realization that the plan he had announced so publicly rested on an assumption that no longer held any weight. I folded my hands on the table, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of my father's foresight. The house on Maple Drive was not a bargaining chip or a quick solution to financial mistakes. It was exactly where Dad had intended it to be, and now, finally, Daniel understood that some decisions are made long before they are revealed. Daniel did not argue much in Mr. Henderson's office after the explanation was repeated a second time in clear, careful language. Instead, he grew quiet in a way I had rarely seen before, staring at the certified copy of the deed as though numbers might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. When the meeting concluded, Mr. Henderson shook our hands and reminded us that grief often complicates practical matters, encouraging us to take time before making any additional financial decisions. Daniel gave a short nod but said very little as we descended the narrow staircase to Main Street. Outside, the late afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. For a moment we stood there without speaking, two adults who had shared a childhood now separated by more than just legal documents. Finally, Daniel asked why Dad had not told him directly. I answered honestly that perhaps Dad had tried in ways Daniel had not wanted to hear. I reminded him of the small loans, the postponed repayments, the uneasy expressions Dad wore after certain phone calls. Daniel insisted that he would have made things right eventually. I did not challenge that claim. I simply told him that Dad had chosen stability over possibility. The difference between those two words seemed to settle heavily between us. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and said he had already counted on the sale to resolve several pressing obligations. I could hear the strain beneath his controlled tone. For the first time since the funeral, he sounded less like a confident planner and more like a man confronting consequences. I told him that the rest of the estate would be distributed according to the will within a reasonable time frame, and that I hoped he would use it wisely. He asked whether I intended to keep the house indefinitely. I replied that Maple Drive was not an investment strategy. It was my home. I had lived there for 12 years not as a tenant waiting for profit, but as a daughter honoring a promise. Daniel looked toward the street where cars passed in steady intervals and said he had felt overlooked for years, as though my presence in the house had gradually replaced him. I considered his words carefully before responding. I told him that presence is not something that replaces another person. It is something that fills empty space. Dad had not asked me to compete with my brother. He had asked me to stay. There is a difference. Daniel exhaled slowly and admitted that he had been embarrassed to discuss his financial struggles openly. Announcing the sale at the cemetery had felt decisive, almost powerful, in a moment when everything else seemed out of control. Hearing that confession did not erase the hurt of his public declaration, but it clarified his motive. He had mistaken urgency for authority. I told him that I did not intend to humiliate him the way he had unintentionally humiliated me. The documents had spoken for themselves. There was no need for further spectacle. I suggested that if he truly wanted to honor Dad, he would focus on rebuilding his own stability rather than dismantling what Dad had built. As we parted ways on that sidewalk, there was no dramatic reconciliation, only a quiet understanding that the path forward would require more maturity than either of us had shown in the past. I drove back to Maple Drive with the windows slightly lowered, letting the cool air move through the car, aware that while the legal matter had been resolved, the emotional distance between us would take far longer to measure and mend. That evening I stood alone on the front porch of Maple Drive, watching the sun lower itself behind the maple tree Dad planted decades ago, its branches stretching wide over the yard like quiet protection. The house looked the same as it had the day before, white railing freshly painted last summer, porch light glowing softly as dusk settled in, yet everything felt different because the weight of uncertainty had finally lifted. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of lemon cleaner and old wood floors. Dad's recliner still faced the television in the corner of the living room, and for a brief moment I imagined him sitting there, offering one of his simple, steady pieces of advice about patience and responsibility. I set my purse on the kitchen table and ran my hand across its worn surface, remembering his words from that Tuesday afternoon years ago when he said the house should stay with the one who stayed. I understood now that his decision had never been about favoritism. It had been about faithfulness. Daniel's announcement at the cemetery had shaken me, not because I doubted the paperwork, but because I had not expected my own brother to see our father's legacy as a solution to his personal missteps. Yet standing there in the quiet of the home I had protected for 12 years, I felt no desire for revenge and no satisfaction in being proven right. What I felt instead was clarity. A house is more than lumber and drywall and market value. It is the echo of laughter down a hallway, the habit of turning on the porch light before dark. The discipline of paying a mortgage month after month even when money is tight. Dad understood that stability is built slowly, sometimes invisibly, and that it must be guarded by someone willing to remain when remaining is inconvenient. I walked through each room that night, touching the doorframes, straightening a picture on the wall, opening the window in the spare bedroom to let in cool spring air. I was not claiming territory. I was reaffirming commitment. Daniel would have to find his own way forward, just as every adult eventually must. I hoped he would learn that responsibility cannot be transferred the way property can. As for me, I turned off the lights one by one and paused at the base of the staircase, listening to the quiet settle in. This home was not a prize I had won. It was a promise I had kept. And as long as I had breath in my lungs and strength in my hands, Maple Drive would remain exactly what Dad intended it to be, a place where loyalty mattered more than convenience and where the ones who stay are never pushed aside.